Well, good evening to you again. This is our last class in 1 Timothy 1 through 3. And we have a lot to get through tonight. I'm not sure I can make it all the way through, but I'd like to try. I certainly cannot finish up elders or deacons. And I want to look at verse 12, verse 11 specifically, about the issue of can women be deaconesses. It's been very controversial and something that we want to at least address and look at, and hopefully you'll appreciate what we are doing. I want you to look on page 33, if you would, in your class notes on 1 Timothy 3, and just at the very bottom of the page there, we want to look at verse 4. An elder is one who rules well his own house, having his children in submission with all reverence. And this really may be one of the most difficult things that we actually teach on. It has to do with whether or not an elder, and in my case, say a pastor, is whether or not an elder's children have to be saved in order for him to be qualified for the ministry. A number of years ago, I remember reading a place in one of John MacArthur's commentary, and he seemed to indicate in that commentary that and it might have been that I actually heard him teaching on it, and he seemed to indicate that if pastors' children, if all their children weren't saved, then he wasn't qualified for the ministry. He couldn't be a pastor, and it created a great deal of consternation in me at that point. For whatever reason, I didn't think that that was correct, and I still don't think that was the correct position. I think that since that time that he has actually sort of matured that instruction and has come to the right and proper conclusion about it. The first word that has to be understood is what Paul means by children. It's a word that specifically means a child. It doesn't mean a teenager or an adult. It's talking, I have children, but they have children, you know. I'm a grandparent. I have a son that's 39 years old, daughter is 37, and another son that's 35. And they're not, they're my children, but they're not a child anymore. And so it is referring specifically to a child, a son or a daughter that is still under the nurture and the care of their parents. My daughter lives on the same property that we do. We live on a farm, and there's plenty of land, and she lives probably a couple hundred yards from our house. I see my grandchildren every day, generally see her every day. But she's not living with us. She's married. She has her own family. She has 4 kids. They live over there, and we just are close. And my youngest son actually lives with us. He works at home, and so we, but he's not under my care and my nurture. He lives with us, and we participate together. He helps around the house and all that kind of stuff, but he's not a child. In fact, the word for children is the word teknon, and it literally means to bear or to beget. So the word is referring to, obviously, to a young child. It's referring to somebody that is not a mature adult. In Titus 1:6, there is more clarification relative to what Paul is addressing here. It says, having faithful children, not accused of dissipation or insubordination. The Holman Christian Standard Bible translates this verse, having children not accused of wildness or rebellion. So the first issue that has to be dealt with has to really do with the faithfulness as to whether or not the elders' children that are living with them, the young children that are living with them, whether or not they are insubordinate or out of control. And there are a lot of young kids that are out of control today. I mean, I'm not just talking about in a necessarily bad way, but just there are a lot of kids that sometimes if you're a young parent, somebody's a young parent, this is the first time that they've done this, and they've got a child, and it's a 3-year-old child, and they haven't learned to properly discipline the children yet, and they may not even know that they ought to be doing that, and the child's just kind of running around, comes to church and just running around wild, screaming and all that kind of stuff. Children be children, we all understand that, we recognize that. But I think that the phrase here, where children must be faithful, it's opposed to being believing. It's not talking about that the child has to be a believing child. And we'll talk about some of the scenarios for that. I think that make this the reasonable interpretation of it. The phrase dissipation or insubordination qualifies the kind of faithfulness that Paul has in mind. He's specifically referring to the behavior of the child and not the spiritual status of that child. It's how that child behaves, because how that child behaves in most cases is a reflection on the parent. It's a reflection on the ability of the parent to control, to be in control, maybe would be the way to say it. We have a lot of children in our church, a lot. And we have some wonderful parents, and then we have some other parents that are younger, some other parents that are just now learning how to be parents, to be disciplinarians of their children, that kind of stuff. And so the word that would qualify the spiritual status of a child would be the word believing. In other words, here in this case, the status of the child is that they are actually living a moral life and are obedient to their parents. But this is all in the context of them still living under the care and the nurturing of their parents. We homeschooled our kids when they were growing up, so they were always with us. They lived in the home, they went to school in our home. And I'm not opposed to sending our kids to school. We have plenty of kids in our school that go to public schools, and there were a lot of things that maybe my kids actually missed out. Not being able to play in certain sports and things of that nature. But it was a family decision, and they enjoyed being at home and being with one another. And church actually fulfilled a lot of their social obligations, social needs that they had, and that was fine with them. It was a family decision that we made together, and they were completely satisfied with that. When Titus 1:6 is compared to 1 Timothy 3:4, most commentators favor the meaning of faithful versus believing, and I think that's the right choice, because the word faithful is concerning more with their behavior. Paul tells Timothy in our text that an elder is one who rules his own house well. He is in control. He's a leader. It'd be hard to be a leader of a church if you couldn't lead your own children and your own family. It says having his children in submission with all reverence. Notice here that Paul does not say that an elder's children must be believers. In this text here, I think we still have to compare it to Titus chapter 1 verse 6. But there's a difference contextually in that Paul is writing here to Ephesus, which is a more mature church than the one that's at Crete. So he simply states here that an elder has to keep his children under control or submissive to his rule in his household. And once again, the focus is not on the children's spiritual status, it's on the children's behavior. Scripture does not demand that the children of an elder be Christians, but it does demand that while they live with him, that they are respectful. It sort of demands that respect, that they are obedient. It seems very unlikely, in my mind, it seems unlikely that Paul would require elders, children in Crete to be believers, but have a lower standard in Ephesus, only requiring them to be faithful or obedient. Ephesus was the more established church. You would think that it would be actually be the reverse. So if all of an elder's children must be professing Christians, then that raises a lot of very difficult questions that I'm not sure that any of us could possibly answer. What if a child is not old enough to understand the gospel and to make what we might consider to be a creditable profession of faith in their life? I mean, certainly that would be the case. I mean, what if you had a 3-year-old, and obviously they come to church, they learn about Christ, they sing their songs, they do all of that, but whether or not they really have an understanding of what it means to be a committed follower of Jesus Christ, to put your faith in, trust your life into His care, I doubt very seriously that a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old, even a 7-year-old, is going to fully understand those kind of concepts. There are a lot of adults that don't understand those kind of concepts. And so, does that mean that the father, because his children one of his children isn't saved, that he is not qualified yet to be an elder? In other words, he can't be an elder until all of his children come to Christ? I mean, does he have to wait until his child professes faith in Christ? And even that might not happen. We know that there's a good possibility that scenario may never happen. There are plenty of godly men who've had ungodly children. But we're not talking about what they become as they mature and become adults, but how they behave themselves in their home. That's why it starts out that he has to rule well his own house. He's got to have some control over his own home. I mean, let's say, for instance, what if an elder has 7 believing children, but his 8th child is not a believer? And so he's done a really great job. He's got 7 out of 8. I mean, to me, that's a wonderful percentage, if I can call it that. I mean, it'd be great to be 100%, but that certainly doesn't happen all of the time. I know of a very godly pastor, very godly individual, and he has several children, and he has indicated to me that that not all of his children are saved, and he knows that. It'd be great if they were, but he knows very specifically that they're not. So, the view that all of an elder's children must be saved is probably much more complicated than Paul ever intended here. I mean, honestly, if you thought about it, and a man had 7 saved children and one of them was not saved, that would disqualify him from a position of leadership? I don't think so. I don't think that's the intent of this passage at all. The children had to be well behaved in their home. And I would say even outside of the home, but not necessarily saved. If they had to be saved, then Paul would be requiring a father to control something that he cannot control. I can't save anybody. I can't ensure that somebody is saved. I can do all of the right things. You can do all of the right things. We can preach the most powerful messages that somebody could hear. We could present the gospel as clearly as it could be presented. We could pray earnestly for somebody over an extended period of time, even fast for them, and yet in reality, they still never come to Christ. Was it our fault? No, it wasn't our fault. We were doing the right thing, and the individual simply just never received and accepted the truth that God has provided. And I certainly believe in the sovereignty of God. I'm very reformed in my soteriology, and I believe in the sovereignty of God. And so even that comes into play. So how can the father be sort of held in a hostage for controlling something that he cannot control? What he can control, is the behavior of his children in his own home. And I would say that, let's just say, as the child got older and they were not willing to be obedient to their father, that the father had some really hard decisions to make about his children and what he was going to require them to do. So Obviously, a father can have influence, but that does not mean that he can ensure that his children become Christians. That would be great. That'd be wonderful. I'd buy into that in a minute if that could happen. But it just doesn't work that way. And just because a father brings his children up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord is no guarantee whatsoever that those children are going to be saved. People quote all the time verse out of Proverbs that says, raise up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he will not depart from it. Well, obviously, I think a lot of people do not understand that passage. What it means is that you raise up a child in the way that he is bent. That's the actual Hebrew, what the term means in Hebrew, that children are bent in a certain way. I mean, there's certain children that have skills and talents, and they have abilities, and they have perspectives, and they have temperaments, and they are bent in a certain direction. And if you raise them up the way that they're bent, when they get older, they will not depart. That is not a verse that you and I can claim that if we'll just raise our kids up properly, that they'll be saved. That would be great. I wish that was the case. But that's not the case at all. And we know that it's not the case from personal experience. And so the testimony of the church is that there have been many faithful parents, many faithful parents who have raised up their children in a way that's honoring and pleasing to Christ, and their children departed and never came to Christ. You could just go through and list all kinds of godly men, started godly institutions who had very ungodly children. And for Paul to place a qualification on an elder that all of his children must be believers is really an impossible situation to place an individual in. I just think it's impossible, and it's an unscriptural burden on the father if you come to that conclusion, which I think would be the wrong conclusion. I don't think any Christian father can guarantee that his children are going to be saved. And even at a young age, if the children come to Christ, I'm not convinced that means, just because they said a prayer when they were 7 years old, that doesn't mean that they have actually been saved. Obviously, it means that God was doing a work in their life, but until they grow up and you see the direction of their life, you don't really know. You don't know what that direction is. And so you just have to be, I think we have to be reasonable about all of this. Salvation always has been, always will be a supernatural act of God, and it's not something that's just totally dependent on bad parents. We have some children that have come to our church, been brought as visitors, and they had very ungodly parents. We had my granddaughter wanted to bring somebody to church with her, and the parents. And just a sweet little girl that was always, my granddaughter and her played together a lot. They went to school together. But the parents will not allow that child to come to church. They don't believe in church. They don't like church. They won't let their kid come to church. And yet my granddaughter shares the Lord with her. They come into her house and they're sitting there and they're talking about it, and in my mind, the young girl has had a lot of opportunities to come to Christ, and at some point she may come to Christ in spite of her ungodly parents. I mean, God certainly works that way at times in people's lives. So an elder has to demonstrate control over his family, and specifically his children, in that they are kept under control with a level of dignity, and they're to be respectful. They're to be disciplined, well disciplined, and it would not be a good thing to have a man as an elder whose children at home are totally out of control. And but obviously the biblical qualifications do not conclude that his children have to be believers. Now, what I want to do, and we may come back to this place if I doubt it, but I want to stop right here. I think the idea that when Paul talks about an elder must not be a novice, I think that's very important. It's just the term elder means something, and but I want us to digress here for a little bit, and I want us to move through the material. And if you look on page 37, right there where it says 1 Timothy 3:8-13, where Paul gives us the qualifications of an elder, and you'll see that I've addressed just some issues about leadership and elders. I've just kind of gone back to a discussion about elders and deacons and leadership. And then on page 41, you'll see that the word deacon there, sort of right there, the second paragraph, that the word deacon is the Greek word diakonos. This is important to the next discussion. That's why I want to look at this here on page 41. And it's very often translated as servant or as messenger. And the only way, so you got it translated as deacon, you got it translated as servant, you got it translated as messenger, and the only way that you can make a determination as to what it actually means is based on the context. So only the context is, you can only determine its exact meaning from the context. So in most cases where the word diakonos is used, it's not used in the way that it's technically used here in 1 Timothy chapter 3. It appears that the use of the term here is to describe an official, and I don't know if this is the right term, I've called it an official church office. I think the better word would be an official church position. It's not what I would consider to be a position of authority. It's a position of service, a recognized position of service within the New Testament church. The actual Greek term is used 29 times in the New Testament, and of those 29 times, only 5 of those occurrences are used to refer to an office holder. And so if you take the entire word group that's derived from this, from the noun or from the verb form, there's 3 words. There's diakonos, which can be translated deacon, servant, or messenger, and only 5 of those are referred to a deacon as we have here in chapter 3. Okay, so the other 24 times it's translated either a servant or a messenger. Then you have the term diakonio, which means to serve, and then you have diakonia, and it means service. So you have the noun form that means a deacon, you have the noun form that means service, and you have the verb form that refers to actually serving. And so all of these words together, all 3 of those words together, appear about 100 times in the New Testament, and the original meaning of this particular word group had to do with performing general service in the church. Just general service, waiting on tables. I'm sorry, I was reading the wrong thing there. Waiting on tables. But the meaning began to be broadened to include any kind of service that somebody did in the church. And, there are a lot of different things to do in a church. There are just multiple things to do. And people have different skill talents, they have different desires, they have different makeups and different personalities, and some people would want to do something that somebody else would not want to do. And so, of all things, I have a man in my church that loves to climb up in trees and cut limbs. Now that sounds kind of crazy, but he just loves to get his chainsaw out and cut and trim up trees. So if he ever found out that we were going to be doing some tree trimming down here at the church, he wouldn't want anybody else to do it. He would want to be the one that would come down here and do that. So these three words, whether you take the noun or the verb forms, they're all translated in a certain way. But of that 100 different kind of uses, I want you to appreciate that we're only talking about 5 times here where it talks about this official position that we are dealing with here in 1 Timothy chapter 3. Other ways that words in this group are translated are administration, cared for, minister, servant, serve, service, preparations, relief, support, and deacon, just to name a few. So you can see that there's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 different ways that these 3 words are translated, and all of it is based on the context of a passage. So the root idea comes from serving, from John chapter 2, verse 5, where the noun form of the word diakonos is used of the waiters at a wedding. It says, his mother said to the servants, to the diakonos. Well, we know that if you look at a passage like that, just from the context of it, he's not talking about deacons, all right? He's just simply not talking about deacons in that passage. It's just the servants that they had in that day. The verb form for serve is used as an example in Luke chapter 4, where Peter's mother-in-law served a meal, and it said in verse 39, so he stood over her and rebuked the fever, and it left her, and immediately she arose and served them. That's not talking about some kind of official position in the church that somebody has. It's a lady that got up and helped somebody. She cooked a meal and served them so they'd have something to eat. She'd been sick. And one interesting use of the noun form is in Romans 13:4, where it's used of policemen and soldiers who enforce justice. For he is God's minister, same word, diakonos, to you for good, but if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is God's minister, diakonos, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. So my point in all of this is what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to communicate that even though the Greek word is the same, the context is different, and the context is what determines the meaning of the particular words that we are addressing here. So I would say that all believers need to be servants. Everybody, if I can use this term, everybody needs to be a deacon. Everybody needs to serve. Every Christian needs to have a servant's heart. That's one of the qualifications for being an active member of our local church, is that you have to be willing to serve. Now, you can't, if you're going to be an active member, a participating active member, let me say it this way. I know this is going to sound a little harsh. It's going to sound a little arrogant on my part. Please forgive me. Just adjust it. We don't want people that are just going to come and sit on the pew. We don't want people to come just so they can serve. Serving is not the goal, okay? But we don't want people that just are going to come and just sit and they don't ever do anything. They don't ever participate. They'd be better off somewhere else. The way I've shared it with my church is that God's not called me to shepherd goats. And so you just have to make the determination of what the word means by the context. And all of us ought to be servants. There is a specific gift of serving in Romans chapter 12, verse 6 through 8. I think that's interesting because there are some people that actually have that gift. It's sort of like Timothy wasn't an evangelist, but Paul told him to do the work of evangelism. And I don't think that I have the gift of serving, but I'm certainly inclined to go serve and to go help. I help people all the time, especially when somebody's building something. We have a house right beside the church that one of the members owns, and he added 2 bedrooms onto it and enclosed his porch. And I went over, actually 3 bedrooms, and I went over there and worked with them for just several weeks. we did all the work. I mean, we built everything and laid everything out and built the whole thing. Put all the siding in, put all the doors in, ran all the electrical, all the mechanical. It was great. It's being a servant. And so I think everybody in the church ought to be a servant. And then the third primary use of the word is the word group that we're talking about here, where we have people that are in an official position, and they are officially recognized as deacons. And what the deacons do, if I can say it this way, is that they model the idea of serving to the other believers. They work alongside the elders. They implement their preaching. They implement their teaching. They implement that into their life. They provide oversight in the practical aspects of the church. I have to say that the deacons that we have in our church, they literally just take care of everything. I know what they're doing. At times they ask for my input, but they take care of what needs to take place in the church. Getting the church clean, keeping the yards clean. I help in all of that. I help because I enjoy that. We're a small church, and I want to be a part of it. I don't want to just be sitting in my ivory tower somewhere. There are a lot of things that we do together. If we have a work day down here, if they want to have a work day, I'm going to be down here during the work day. I'll bring all my tools. I'm going to do everything that I can to participate in what the church is actually doing. And so, in reality, their ministry is very broad. It encompasses almost everything that goes on within the church except the primary responsibility of preaching and teaching and leading. And it's an enormous privilege as well as much as it is a responsibility. And now, I want to move on to the controversial area, and I want you to turn, if you would, to page 44. I've given you a list at the top of the page of just in our culture. It would be different in another culture. For instance, I've got Sunday school. In Zimbabwe, they don't have Sunday school. They just have a tree that they meet under. And but there are a lot of different things that I've listed there in the first paragraph. You can read that. And the following statement right there in the middle at first may seem a little bit awkward, but I think it's accurate, and I think it's something that you would agree with, is that the deacons are not given to the church to serve the elders. The deacons don't serve me. They support me as their pastor. They support the other elders as the leaders in the church, obviously. But they're called to serve the church. For instance, if you went to Acts 6, which some people say were the first deacons, and I would say that they may have been the model for the first deacons, but they were not the first deacons. They weren't appointed as deacons. They just had a need in the church, and the apostles wanted to give themselves more to the study of the Word and prayer, so they went out and they asked the church, hey, just select 7 men of good report and full of the Holy Spirit, and they did. Stephen was one of those men, obviously. Did they have that ministry of serving? I think they did. They had a hard job. They were having to take care of the Hellenistic widows who felt like they were being neglected because they didn't speak the same language, and so it was kind of an issue in the church, and they went out and resolved it and took care of it. And so what it says is that these men. It doesn't mean that the deacons and the elders don't communicate just because the deacons have been given to the church. They certainly do communicate, but what it does mean is that their primary function is to the overall body of Christ and to making sure that the church, the local church that they're a part of, runs smoothly. The people that handle the finances in our church are not elders. we know what the finances are, but we don't make out the reports, we don't handle the money, we don't do any of that. There are other people in the church that do that, that manage that. It's just part of their ministry, it's part of their serving. And everybody ought to have a love and a care and an appreciation and an affection for each other and for the work that everybody's doing in the church. It ought to be recognized. I recognize the men that are deacons in our church. I recognize them whenever they do something, and some of them don't like me doing that, but I think they need to be recognized at times. And so I mean, when you have this kind of relationship between the servants and the leaders and the congregation, if I can say it this way, then you really begin to have church. You have a church that's operating like a church ought to operate. Now, I want to begin here. I just want to make sure I have enough time. I think I do. I was talking very fast there. Please forgive me and rushing through the material and kind of overlooking some. But I want to address a fairly controversial issue. At the end of it, I'll give you my position on it. I'm going to present both sides. I think that's a good way to look at it, because there may be something in both elements that are important. And it's a fairly controversial issue. It's whether or not women can be deacons in a local church. And what I want to do is I want to approach, the way I want to approach this subject is to look at the various scriptures that people use to address the issue on both sides, okay? We're going to look at both sides. I'll say it now, I'll say it again later. If you went to John MacArthur's church, they have women deacons. And the reason that they have women deacons is because the ruling body of their church are elders. So if you're in a church, let's say for instance right now that you're in a church and your church does not have elders, but the primary leadership body in your congregation is that of deacons, then I would say that having a woman deacon, having a woman that's in a position of leadership and teaching and leading and ruling would be completely inappropriate. So I would say, okay, just at a high level, I'm not trying to give away how I believe, because I think in the end you may be a little surprised, but if you have a church form of government where the deacons, where you just don't even have elders, and all that you have are deacons, then in reality you would never have women deacons in that ruling position. However, excuse me, if you took a church like John MacArthur's and you had a very, very strong elder body, which they do, I don't know how many elders they have, but they have multiple ministries with the school and the Master's Seminary and the Master's College and all of that, and the worldwide ministry that he has, the teaching ministry and Grace to You and just everything else that goes on there at Grace Church. I don't know how many, what they have. They have the Shepherd's Conference that they have every year for pastors. But it's a large undertaking. It's a worldwide ministry, and all the books that he writes and all of that kind of stuff. If you have elders as a ruling body, then it makes it easier to recognize women in a position of service. All right? If you don't have that, it'd be impossible. If I'm not mistaken, I believe that Mark Deaver, who is the pastor of the Second Baptist Church in Washington, D.C., he and John MacArthur, they speak together at conferences all the time. If I'm not mistaken, I believe that he has elders and deacons and would recognize women in positions of service. So I don't want to take this lightly, because I personally believe that we have many women who are genuine servants, and they deserve recognition what they do. Our church couldn't operate without the ministry that the women have. They have a much more powerful ministry to the children. They are in the Awana program that we have. It's probably we probably have, I would say, maybe even more men involved in the teaching aspect of it as we do women. It may be 50-50. I don't know exactly what it is. But whatever it is, it's a good balance. And the word for deacon is the actual word for servant. And so, as we saw just a little bit earlier in the word group of diakon, diakonos, diakonia, and diakonoia, I didn't pronounce that right. I'm just terrible at Greek. I'm terrible at speaking English, nevertheless the Greek. Even though it occurs about 100 times, the primary way that the word is translated is as servant. That's the primary meaning of the word. It's somebody that serves, not somebody that leads and not somebody that rules. So it gives even more credibility, just the definition of the word gives more credibility to the fact that a church would be governed by elders rather than by deacons. I'm a Baptist pastor, and I have to be honest with you, I'm a little confused as to why Baptist churches have not recognized this. I think the reason is, it's just an opinion on my part, that it could be that Baptist churches are not reformed as reformed as other denominations are. Let's say the Presbyterians, and they think that if they go to elders that they are going to be considered to be reformed in their theology, and they don't want that to happen. I don't know that that's the case. That's just an opinion on my part as to how some of this has developed or has not developed properly throughout the years. However, we saw in 1 Timothy that the word is translated as deacon because it represents an official position in the church. We recognize deacons. Your church probably recognizes deacons in your congregation. And I want to reiterate up front once again that and I've got here Baptist churches, but I don't think I ought to limit it to that, but that's one of the primary denominations that probably would not have elders. If that's the case, and that deacons are the ruling body, then everything that I'm going to talk about for them would be a moot point. They just simply would not recognize it. They just would not recognize that you could actually have a woman deacon. In 1 Timothy 3:11, it says likewise. Now this is very important. The word likewise here. This is very, very important and crucial in the argument for both sides. And I think it becomes apparent as we go through here. In 1 Timothy 3:11, it says, likewise, their wives must be reverent, not slanderers, temperate, faithful in all things. Now, I want you to, I've given you a number of translations here, probably 4, 5, 6 or so, and I want you to appreciate that the translators are somewhat evenly divided as to whether the word it's translated as wives or whether it's translated as women. And we'll look at the word and we'll see what we think that it ought to mean. The Amplified says, the women likewise must be worthy of respect. The New American Standard says, women must likewise be dignified. The New Revised Standard Version says, women likewise must be serious. The ASV says, women in like manner. And the RSV says, the women likewise must be serious. So the difference in the way that it's translated is that these translations that I've just read here, these 5, and it's evenly divided. If you went through and you looked at a parallel Bible and on my computer I probably have 25 or 30 different translations that I can look at, and it's evenly divided. Some translated women, some translated wives, for different reasons that we will look at here in just a minute. So the difference in the way that it's translated is that these These translations see that it should be translated as women rather than as wives. So the question is whether or not Paul is speaking about the requirements here of a deacon's wife or of a woman deacon. That's the question. And I would say that under the leadership model of having elders and then deacons that are just servants and not leaders, not ruling, that it would be a woman deacon, a woman servant may be the way to say it. The Greek word used here for women is gunikos. Gunikos. Remember when we saw this word? It's talking about a one-woman man, and that was the word that was used, and it can refer either to women. It can refer specifically to wives. It can refer to either one. Once again, you have to make the determination based on the context of the passage. In Vine's dictionary, it says that it denotes a woman married or unmarried. Well, obviously, if the woman was unmarried, that would have certainly a different aspect here as we interpreted this, or it can mean a wife. So it's the context that must govern the interpretation of the word usage. For instance, Matthew 11:11, surely I say to you, among those born of women. Well, obviously, we're not talking about a servant here. We're not talking about a wife. We're not talking about a wife. The context becomes clear here. In Matthew chapter 14, verse 21, now those who had eaten were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Same word that's translated wife, wives here in verse 11. It's the same Greek word, gunakos, and it's translated women. Why? Because of the context. It's not talking about wives out there that had children. He's just talking about women. In Galatians 4, but when the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth His Son, born of a woman, born under the law. Same Greek word. So the argument is that if Paul was referring to the wives of deacons, that he would have indicated it as being their wives. In other words, it would be like, and you can see, if you have the King James Version, if you look back in our notes somewhere, you can see that the word there is actually in italics, which means that it's not there in the Greek text. It's been added by the translators because the way that they translated it in the King James and the New King James is that they thought that the word, they believed that the word meant wives and not women. So that's why they added the word there to imply that it was referring to the wives and not just, you wouldn't say they're women. You would just say women. But what I'm sharing with you is that in the Greek text, is that the word there is not there. It's just the word gunakos. So it's in italics, and that's what it means. So using the word women was the only way that Paul could distinguish them from the male deacons. Let me back up. I said that if what Paul is doing here is giving us sort of a position of a woman deacon. In other words, he's given us the position of an elder. He gives us the office of an elder, the position of a deacon, and now he wants to talk about women also being deacons. We know that there weren't any female elders. That was clear. And now he's given the office of a deacon, and he wants that to be clear. And it says in verse 12, let deacons be the husbands of one wife. So he's talking about males, obviously. Same word, be a one-woman man. But if he was, in this verse, if somehow he was developing a new office, not a new office, but a new position that was kind of not clear out there of a deaconess, then he wouldn't use the word wife. And the word there would not be included in the text. And it would be the word that Paul would have to use to make that distinction, to make that the distinction between the man and the woman. And I have to personally be intellectually honest to the text and state that the word gynakos, the word for women, because the text can be translated as, literally translated as women likewise, can be applied to either, it can have an application to either women individually as a separate group, or it can easily apply to a deacon's wife. It could be translated either way. And so the problem is, and even the translators are a little bit, that's the right word, they are a little bit, they have a different feeling about it. And it gives a different meaning to the text if you use the word wife or if you use the word woman or women. And they're divided on that. They think it's obviously because of verse 8 through 10, and then continuing with verse 12, that it's 12 and 13, that it obviously is talking about the wives of the deacons. And others say, no, it doesn't say that. It doesn't say that. It just says women. And so Paul is kind of introducing sort of a new position, if you would, that hasn't been mentioned before. And it could be either one. I have to be honest. I mean, I'm not going to say that it's this or it's that. What I'm saying is that it can be either one. And the text doesn't tell us which one that it is. We just know that it's translated women likewise. It could be translated wives likewise. It could be translated either way. And so the determination has to be made somehow as to what you believe it is. So the argument is that Paul is introducing, for some, is that Paul is actually introducing another office. I don't call it office. I call it another position, and not merely referring to the wives of deacons. Now, the reason that argument, that they say that, if you look at the text, is because of the use of the word likewise. He gives the elders the qualifications of an elder in verses 1 through 7, and then in verse 8 he's giving the qualifications of a deacon clearly, and he begins that by saying likewise. In other words, in the same manner, we had qualifications for an elder. In the same manner now we have qualifications for a deacon. And then he uses the word likewise again here in verse 11, and it's because it can be translated likewise women. That's the way that if you look at the top of the page, women likewise, women in like manner, women likewise, women must likewise, the women likewise, those five that we read, they would say that, hey, because of the word likewise, which is in the text, it's in the Greek language, is referring again, just like deacons, he was introducing a new group with deacons, he's now introducing a new group with the women deacons. And so it's the use of the word likewise that creates the basis for saying that he's introducing this new position. And in looking at the flow of the passage, it kind of looks like this. You'll see at the bottom of page 45, a bishop then must be blameless. Likewise, deacons must be reverent. Likewise, their wives or women must be reverent. The other argument that is used to say that Paul is not talking about deacons' wives is that he does not give any qualifications for the elders' wives. In other words, if you go up here, there's no qualification for the elders' wives. So in their mind, it wouldn't make sense to say, all right, I mean, the elder would be the, if I can say it this way, can be the higher position. I don't like that term, but just for the sake of what we're developing here, it would be the higher position over the deacon, not spiritually, but just in functionality, and so what they would be saying is that if the elders who have the higher position, that there's nothing said about their wives, why would you take a lesser position and then begin to give qualifications for their wives? I guess the idea that if you had qualifications for the lesser position wives, that you would certainly have it for the higher qualification. So it seems unlikely that Paul would add such a requirement to the office of deacon if the more important office of the overseer, the bishop, the elder, has no such requirement. So the idea is that Paul would not have stricter qualifications for deacons than he actually has for the elder. In other words, the family of the deacon wouldn't have stricter qualifications than the family of the elder. And the overall argument is that because the office of a deacon is not a ruling office, but an office of serving, that the passage is referring to women specifically, not wives, who are servants, who are involved in a serving role. And if you were to go and look at your church, there are probably women that serve in different areas. Let's just take, for instance, in my church, not in every church, but in my church, we have a pianist and an organist, and they're both women, and they're very faithful, and they come for all the services, and they play, and they're prepared, and they do all of that. I believe that they're servants. I mean, honestly believe that those are godly women. They're servants. We have women that handle the children's ministry. Have two specific women that do that. They're just outstanding in that. The leadership for Awana is primarily men, but the women are there to constantly be helping. So, if you look at Romans chapter 16, there's the issue of Phoebe. It says, I commend to you Phoebe, our sister, who is a diakonos, who is a servant. So, some people would want to translate it this way, that who is a deaconess, because it's the same word diakonos, same word for deacon. And she is a servant, a diakonos of the church in Cenchrea, that you may receive her in the Lord in a manner worthy of the saints, and assist her in whatever business she has need of you. In other words, she's come to you, she's been commended by Paul. She is a servant in this church, and they have sent her there for some specific business to do, to handle something specifically. So there are those who believe that the word for servant should be translated in this passage as the word deacon, as referring to somebody who has an official position and not just someone who is a servant. But Paul uses the masculine form of diakonos to refer to a woman. And I have to say that that's not normal. It's just not normal. But the argument would be, the argument on their side, so from that perspective, the argument is that Paul is not referring to one who is a servant, just a servant, but because he uses the masculine form, we know it's a woman, but he uses the masculine form, therefore it is referring to the office of deacon. Okay? That's where the argument would lead, that Paul is referring to this specific office of deacon. This is the only place where Paul speaks of someone being a diakonos of an actual local church. It's the only place that Paul actually mentioned this. Thirdly, Phoebe is sent to perform an official task on behalf of Paul and on behalf of her church. So he commends her to the church at Rome and urges the Christians there to aid her, since she is there to perform some important business for the church. And the argument is that an official task required an office. Now, for me, that's not a good argument. It's just not. Just because she's doing something important for the church doesn't mean that. I think everything somebody does for the church is important. We have a lady in our church that is she's a CPA, and she handles one of the biggest accounts in maybe in the state. One of the richest people in our state, and if we had some accounting issues, we would send her. I mean, I would want her to be there, even if the elders were there. She could go on our behalf and speak on our behalf. And why? Because she's about as smart as it gets. But because of that, because I send her out on some official business, doesn't mean that she's necessarily a deacon. She's just serving. She's doing what every Christian ought to do in a church. She's serving in her church. Now, these are the primary arguments, the ones that I've just given you, for affirming women to be deacons. But I want to look at the opposing arguments as well, because I think they're just as convincing, if I can say it that way. They have just as much credibility as these arguments that have been given here. In reference to 1 Timothy 3, verse 11, in the immediate context of the other verses, the Greek term gune is translated wife. For example, in verse 2, Paul states that overseers must be the husband of one wife, gune. So he uses the same term and translates it as wife in verse 12. So in verse 2, you've got the husband of one wife. In verse 12, you got the husband of one wife, the word gune. And if that's the case, then you would think that if verse 11 was referring to a wife, that he would use the same word. It only makes sense that if you got a passage, it's all about the same thing, and you have a word that means the same thing, that you would use the same Greek word to describe what is being said. So, but he uses the same term, and he translates it in verse 2 and verse 12 as wife. So the argument is that to be consistent with the usage of the word in the overall passage, it should be translated as wife or wives. My understanding of the Greek language is that this is normally the case. You do not take the same word form noun and use it in different ways in the same passage. It's a little confusing to me because we know that the term that's used here for women, the word gunakis is the term that refers to that's used as wife in verse 2 and the wife in verse 12. And so if you have the word guna, which is a form of the word gunakis, it's what it is, then it should in that same case be translated as wife. You just, in the Greek, you don't, and even in English, you use the same word in the same paragraph to mean the same thing. And that only makes sense. I mean, I would just say that this is a very, very strong argument here, is the point that I'm trying to make. This is a very strong argument that it ought to be translated as wife. Secondly, in the context, the possessive article there is not needed to make the passage understandable as referring to the wives of the deacons, especially if you're going to translate the words consistently throughout the passage. So it's not like you have to say their wives. You can just say wives in the Greek, and it would be understood. And the point is that it should be obvious that if you're talking about the deacons and in verse 10, and you're talking about the deacons in verse 12, that you're still talking about the deacons and their wives in verse 11. It would have a good flow to it. So it would seem that if Paul was changing over from verse 10 to the deacons and then going to speak about another office, if we can call it that, another position, that what he would have said is he would have said something like women who serve as deacons, but he did not do that. He did not use those terms. He did not say it. He did not say it that way. Thirdly, it does not seem likely that in verse 12 that Paul is switching back to male deacons without giving some indication that he ever left the topic. In other words, if I were in a conversation, I wouldn't go in one sentence talking about cars, and then in the next sentence talk about dogs, and then in the next sentence start talking about cars again. There's got to be some way that you transition from subject to subject. That's part of being a good writer, is that you know how to transition from one topic to the next. And it just at a high level, it doesn't seem that Paul goes from talking about deacons to talking about something completely contrary to that. I mean, not contrary to it, but just one sentence here. It's just a number of words. But he's given qualifications there. It seems that the flow would continue to be that of just the deacons. And so if Paul were actually talking about deacons and deaconesses, then it would seem that he needed a translation, a clear translation from one to the other. And that's where the argument on the other side uses the idea, says that the term likewise is the word that makes that transition. It's the transitional element. So to base the office of deaconess on only one verse in the New Testament. Now, you got somebody, I say one verse, you've got like what we read in Romans chapter 16 about Phoebe as an example. You could probably use that if that were your argument. But to base the office of deaconess on only one verse in the New Testament seems to be somewhat unusual and certainly not consistent, I think, with good exegesis. I would never develop doctrine off of one passage. I say I would never, but in my mind it's not a good, healthy position for somebody to take. Fourthly, if Paul was referring to women deacons in verse 11, then it would be expected that he would have given some references to their marital fidelity. In other words, you would almost think that it would be the wife of one husband. You know, that he would say that if he's going to say that the elder has to be the husband of one wife and the deacon has to be the husband of one wife, you would think that he would also say that the wife has to be that the wife has to be the wife of one husband. That the woman has to be the wife of one husband. But he doesn't. He doesn't make any mention of their fidelity. And even the widows who are to be supported by the church, it says in 1 Timothy 5:9, do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number, and not unless she has been the wife of one man. So here you got a widow, and he gives some marital conditions relative to her. Fifthly, the argument that the word likewise is what constitutes a new office is really not compelling. For instance, in 1 Timothy 2, it says, I desire therefore the men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting, in like manner, or likewise, also that the women adorn themselves in modest apparel. So Paul uses the word likewise to link the two together, but they're very different comments. Men are to pray and women are to dress appropriately. So the argument in verse 11 is that Paul is saying that just as deacons are to be dignified, likewise so are their wives. It's the idea that, hey, if you got a godly man, he needs a godly wife. And so in much the same way, it appears that whereas verses 8 through 10 are talking about the basic qualifications of the deacon, verse 11 through 12 are talking about their home life, what goes on in their home. He's got a wife that's reverent, she's not a slanderer, she's temperate, she's faithful in all things. And the faithful in all things could be a reference to her being the wife of one husband, being her marital fidelity. It could include that. Let me put it that way. It doesn't necessarily mean that. So there are 7 verses for elders, and it appears that there are 6 verses for deacons. And it would be a little presumptuous, I think, on our part to think that Paul had forgotten about a man's family and marital fidelity and then had to include it as an afterthought. I don't think that's the case, So, sixthly, if Paul had intended to establish an additional office, it does not seem that it would have been kind of incidental, just one little verse, but that it would have been explicit. He's got 7 verses on the elders, and he's got that in the book of Titus, and then he's got deacons, and you would think there would just be more than one verse if that's what he was doing. He lists 15 requirements for elders, and 9 or 10 for deacons, and he's only given 4 if he's referring to women deacons. He's only given them 4. And it would be a little strange if you took the overall context of 1 Timothy that we looked at and we talked about in chapter 2 about the negative influence that some of the women, the contentious attitude that they had developed, and we're going to find more of that when we get to chapter 5, the younger widows and what had happened to them, and they're just going about house to house and gossiping. You would think that if that were the case, that then in reality that Paul it's almost like he would have more than just 4 qualifications if in reality the women in the congregation are not behaving appropriately. You would just think that. But that's not the case. One of the primary elements to help us understand this passage is to see it in the light of being a servant. Just in the light of being a servant. By listing specific qualifications for a deacon's wife, it appears that what Paul is saying is that because the deacons were not involved in the ruling and teaching ministry of the local church, which was forbidden for women over men in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 12, but in a serving ministry, that their wives could easily be involved in their ministry as well. In other words, my wife at our church is not involved in the leading and teaching ministry of the church. She's just not involved in that. She teaches in Awana, she teaches Sunday school, she heads up the nursery, which has got to be the hardest job in the church. And but she, as an individual, she's not involved in ruling and in leading and in teaching at the congregational level. And so it could be called a team effort or a joint effort for a deacon, though, who is involved in all of the practical aspects of the church and just keeping the church running and working properly. That aspect of what the deacon does would certainly involve their wives. And so a person simply does not have to hold some kind of official office to be a servant. In the case of the elders, there's no mention of their qualifications for their wives, and but in the deacons that it is, and I think that seems very reasonable and very legitimate. I would say that the office of an elder and that their wives should be servants. I think that whatever qualifications there are for the wives of the deacons, you certainly ought to have those for the wives of the elders. It would only be appropriate that they had the same kind of qualifications. Just because of the place that they hold, they're just as important as the deacons' wives. But since that office of elder is it's serving in a different way in a leadership role, I can see that there is the distinction that allows us to just provide the qualifications for the deacons' wives. Let's take the case of the 7 men in Acts. They were not formal deacons, but they were certainly servants, and their primary ministry was to the widows. Now just think about this for a minute. It only seems reasonable to me that if those men were going to be involved with other women, that it would just seem that their wives ought to be involved in that. I don't ever counsel with a woman by myself, ever. It just never happens. I don't go into a room with a woman by myself and shut the door. If I ever counsel with women, my wife is always there. Always. She's always there. Or at least another man in the church, one of the other elders. There have been times when I've had a deacon in there with me. Just somebody else is in there. But you can imagine the necessity for having if these men had this service to the women, how important it would be for them to actually have their wives with them, if they were married, to help in that particular ministry. And so the parallel of the wives of the apostles would not have assisted their husbands in teaching and preaching the word, but the wives of the deacons would. Now, if this aspect of the deacons' wives being qualified to help them is a proper interpretation, then I think it would shed a little bit of light on the issue of Phoebe in Romans chapter 16. She was simply sent on an official mission by Paul. I could ask any woman in my church to go and perform an official ministry. Most scholars believe that she was the person that Paul actually had deliver the letter to the church at Rome. So in her case, it's not a designation of an office, it's just the designation that she was somebody that was willing to serve, which all of us ought to be willing to do. She was sent on an official task, and in order to be honest to the text and to our understanding of it, there was actually no Greek word for a female servant. It just didn't exist. So when Paul gets to her and he's trying to communicate the aspect of her being a servant, there was no word, there was no actual Greek word for a female servant, like deacon, like deaconess, and so he just used the male terminology in that case. And so in the church, no one is excluded from being a servant. Everybody can be a servant as long as their character is godly. For me personally, the evidence is not substantial enough to say that Paul is creating a separate office of deaconess. That's an opinion on my part. You can take the information, you can come to your own conclusions. I would say that if you were in a church that that only had deacons, that it wouldn't even be a consideration. You couldn't even consider it in that case if they're the ruling kind of they're the ruling body of the church. I think that would be divisive. That would be terribly divisive and not healthy for the church. And so the elders ought to be servants. The elders' wives ought to be servants. The deacons ought to be servants. The deacons' wives ought to be servants, and the members of the congregation ought to be servants. It's really a high calling to be a servant. Jesus said that if you want to be first in His kingdom, that you ought to be a servant. You know, to me, that's a high calling that some people, they would rather have a position, an official position, but we have people in our church, I'm sure you have people in your church, that they're just servants. They're willing to do whatever you want them to do. And we have one guy that's a deacon in our church. We have two of them actually that they would just do anything for you that you needed to have done. They'll come to your house, they'll build something for you, they'll take care of it, they'll come after work, they'll do whatever they have to do. It's just in their genes. It's just a part of who they are. And Jesus said in Matthew 23, the verse I just quoted, "But he who is greatest among you shall be your servant." Mark 10 says, "For even as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." I would say that the deacon's ministry is very broad. It encompasses almost every aspect of the church except the primary responsibility of preaching, teaching, and of leading, ruling, whatever you want to call it. And if the deacons are to assume the responsibilities for the fundamental upkeeping of the church and keeping it going, then with the overall strategy of male leadership, I personally believe that 1 Timothy 3 is referring to godly deacons, godly men who have godly servant wives to help them, and not to female deacons. Personally, I do not see that one verse, verse 11, is describing a new office within the church that is not really mentioned anywhere else. Now, to balance all of that out, and I'm not trying to I have a position on it. It's not a hill I want to die on, if I can put it that way. I would not argue, though, against those churches who have a very strong elder body leading the church and who have chosen to recognize what they consider to be men deacons and women deacons. Let's just say, for instance, if you look at, say, let's see if I can find the verse here. Just hang on just a minute. You think I would already know this. It's the verse that talks about that the older women ought to teach the younger women. Let's just say, I know in my church that I had that. We had an elderly lady who taught a primary women's class, and all the women wanted to be in that class. I think some of the men wanted to be in that class. This was a godly woman, and she studied, and she was a great teacher, and she knew how to teach, and I thought that her primary ministry, just my own personal feeling as her pastor, that her primary ministry should have been to the younger women. Her husband passed away a number of years ago, and she after that she kind of gave up the teaching responsibility, which was her decision. She's an elderly lady. It's just a little more difficult, and she wanted to pass the mantle on to somebody else, which she did. But as an older woman, she just had so much grace about her life, and she was able to. She ministers. She actually, of all things, handles the finances in our church, I mean, she handles the money and everything. She's the primary one that does. But you know, in my mind, I'm just going to say it this way: she's a deaconess. She's a servant. She's not exercising any authority. She's not leading. She's not ruling. If I wouldn't, I mean, I see her that she's a servant, and you know, it's like I like the word servant. It's almost like you could just change the terms around and just say a servant. You know, a theocratic servant, a God-ordained leader servant, type person. But I just wouldn't argue with those who've chosen to recognize both male and female deacons. Here's what I would argue with. I would argue with liberal theology that had a feminist notion to it. You know, that said that Paul was a male chauvinist and that God, you know, the male part of the scriptures needs to be removed. You know, I would argue with that because I think the intent is wrong. It's so that the women can lead. You know, and there are a lot of Baptist churches that went into the liberal, onto the liberal thing, and what they have in those churches, the fellowship part of the Southern Baptist Convention, whatever it is, they have deacons. They don't have elders. And so the women that are deacons are really in a ruling capacity, and I think that's a tremendous violation of. Let me say, the ones that I know of locally, that's the way that it works, and that to me that's a very improper exegesis of the passage, and that they are grossly in error, and it's just not biblical. It's the wrong motive. Everything is just out of place. It's not right. And so, but as long as those individuals that we're talking about are not in a position of ruling, it does not appear that being dogmatic about the interpretation of this passage is advantageous. And I mentioned to you earlier that John MacArthur's church, I believe Mark Deaver's church, I know that John MacArthur's church has women deacons, but they have a very strong body of elders, and the elders lead, and the women and the deacons serve, and they have women that are deaconesses, and they serve. I don't know what their exact ministries are, but I think normally it would be probably to the children. It would be to the younger women. You know, it would be caring for the elderly. You know, kind of a you know, helping with children on a mother's night out or something like. I don't know what it might be, but I don't. I think they're servants, and they serve, and their church basis having women deacons on the positive aspects that we looked at initially. Now they have a great church and they function biblically, and to make an issue with them that they have women deacons, I think would just be. It would just be, you know, just inappropriate. I think it would be too divisive. They understand 1 Timothy 3. And they've taken a verse here that, honestly, from a hermeneutical standpoint and an exegetical standpoint, can go either way. You can't just be dogmatic and says it can only be one way. It can go either way, and that's why the translators are divided on how the thing was actually interpreted. And if I can put it this way, I've known a lot of deacons who were not godly, and they did not meet the qualifications in 1 Timothy 3. I've been in churches, you've been in churches, and there were men that just were not necessarily godly men. When I first came here to my church, they had 3 deacons, maybe 4, and I thought that all of them were godly men. I did. They were elderly. They were older men. I mean, it was an old church when I got here, and I've done all their funerals and buried their wives, but they were godly women, men, and I loved them and I respected them. The difference is that they had no understanding of what an elder was. In reality, you could have considered them to be an elder, except for the fact that none of them could teach. There wasn't one of them. There were 4 of them, and none of them were apt to teach. So to me, they really were deacons, and they were not elders. I don't think we had any elders in our church at that time. So I've known a lot of deacons who were not godly. They wouldn't meet the qualifications, and in that case, I've written down notes. I would much prefer a woman performing a task than an ungodly man. And so the issue always revolves around godliness in the life of the individual. We have many godly women performing tremendous service in our church. We're not going to call everybody a deacon. We're not going to, just because they serve. We're not going to call them a deacon. I think that it's kind of an official thing that has to be obvious and recognized. And but there are a lot of people that are serving in the church in a lot of different capacities, and their value to our church cannot be overestimated. In fact, I don't think that we could actually function without them in any way. Now, I want to stop here. I probably have got another 20-25 minutes before our time runs out. And I think I'm just going to stop, and you can read the rest of the notes about deacons. I think it's important. It gives the qualifications for them. And then if you look on page 54, if you'll just turn there for a minute, you'll see that there's a fairly, 54, 68, there's about 14 pages there on the pillar and ground of the truth. And I think that you will find that the first part of that section there is very, very important. I think it's a strong word, and it talks about the responsibility that we as a church have to uphold the truth. I've tried to take the controversial, today I've tried to take the controversial issues, especially as we saw it in chapter 2, and how you're going to handle the scripture. And I have a position on 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 11. My own personal position, and I have to be honest with you that over the years I have really wrestled with it. I've wrestled with it because I felt like it was an either, it wasn't an either or, but it was either. I mean, it's like you could have both. You could have, it could be referring to their wives. I think just the word guna from Ganakis is that's a word that it can be translated as women, but it's translated as wives in the others, and I think it was right to be translated wives. That it would be translated wife there as well. I think that would be the correct interpretation of it. And so I've wrestled with it, and I've come to the conclusion that I don't see that it's creating a separate office. I don't see that. I don't see that it's a separate position, that we'd have elder, deacon, and deaconesses. I just don't see that. What I see is that you have leaders and you have servants. And that's the way that I see it. You have leaders and you have servants. And the leaders are men and the servants can be men or women. Anybody can be a servant. And even though there's an official position of serving, I would not in any way do anything or say anything that discredited the service of a woman in a local church. I wouldn't do that. That's not healthy. That's not good. I would elevate that. I would say, hey, these are godly women. We love them. They're just wonderful. They have an incredible impact on our church and on its development. We can't survive without them. and appreciate that that's a very, very real element within any local church. And so if we make it more, let me back up. I'm a technician. I want to be technically right. And when I look at the verse, when I look at the arguments on both sides, I gave you more arguments on verse 11 for the traditional position that it's not talking about deaconesses than I did say the position that John MacArthur's church would take. But by the same token, I probably could have given you some more arguments on the MacArthur side of that, which I did not. And it's not something that we ought to allow to be an issue. I remember years ago when I taught on this in my church, this was years ago, that I made the statement that I felt that we had deaconesses in our church. But I called them, I said, I don't want to call them deaconesses. I want to call them servants. We have many, many male servants and many, many female servants in our church. And it was almost like, even, there are only 5 uses of this word deacon, so it's almost like the bigger picture. I think it should be translated deacon. I think it is an official thing. But in the bigger picture, at a unifying level, we ought to see ourselves as servants, and the people ought to see themselves as servants. And if you as a pastor or as a leader, as a teacher, what you want to do is that you want to promote the intent of what is being developed here. And so I see that the argument is a little bit stronger not to have the office of deaconess, but once again, I would not contend with my brothers and sisters who saw it a little bit differently. I would contend if they didn't have elders. If you're in a church and you don't have elders, you're a Baptist church and you don't have elders. I know that many of you may be Pentecostal, you may be Presbyterian, you may be anything, Assembly of God, whatever. That's great. God bless you. So I'm not just saying it. I'm just saying in a Baptist church, the normal thing is that you don't have elders. In a Presbyterian church, you do have elders and you have deacons, so it would be less of an issue for them. And certainly in other churches they have elders. And having said all of that, and understanding that, I think what we want to do is that we want to keep everything in perspective. I don't think that the argument here is that Paul is making is one where he's just trying to defend a position that you got to have a woman deacon in a church. I just don't think that's there. You have to really, you got to grind it. You got to grind through something really hard to get to that conclusion. But I don't think that to be intellectually honest to the passage that you can preclude that. Maybe is the way I should say it. So if the scriptures almost allow, I'm one of those guys that believes that there's only one correct interpretation for a passage. That only means one thing. I'm not sure I know what it means. What I'm saying is that sometimes when the clarity of it may not, where it may not be as clear as we want it to be, I think what it should do is that it should create in us a spirit where we're not going to be overly dogmatic about our position on it. I would never criticize John MacArthur's church or Mark Deaver's church. I just would never criticize their church because they had women deacons. I would commend them. I would say, well, hallelujah. And I could embrace it. I could be comfortable in it. If I went to their church, I could just embrace it. I just think the freedom is there. If I went to another church and they didn't have that, it would be like, well, hallelujah, I can embrace that because you don't have to, based on these verses. So I'm not trying to be nebulous or vague about this. I'm just saying that there is there are legitimate arguments on both sides, and all that does is it sort of it helps me to not be overly aggressive against my brother that may disagree with me in that area. If you don't have elders, if you don't have elders, you can't have women deacons. It's done. It's a done deal. So next semester I'll be teaching 1 Timothy 4 through 6. A lot of issues there. Chapter 4 is a tremendous passage. I don't think that we have the same kind of issues in those 3 chapters that we have here in 1 Timothy 1 through 3, but hopefully we don't have any critical issues of how we're going to handle the scriptures. I think everything is very, very clear. I think the only thing that's a little questionable is the first verse, the thing of apostasy in chapter 4 verse 1, and we will talk about that. I want to thank you for being a student, not only at Covington, but a student in this class. I hope that you can appreciate that we've put in a good bit of work to provide you with, this is a fairly significant resource for you to have in your library, and hopefully you will use it like that. You can use these notes, you can use them to teach from, utilize them in any way that you want to. I pray that God would just use all of this as a tremendous blessing in your life. If you don't mind, this is our last class. I normally don't pray before or after the class. I know a lot of the professors do, and I don't. It's not because I don't think prayer is important. I do. I very much believe in prayer, but I would like to close in prayer and just ask God's blessing on your life. Heavenly Father, thank you for these men and women that have been involved in this course. I pray that there's nothing that we've said that has been offensive to them. If there anything that I've communicated has been offensive, I pray that you would forgive me, give me more clarity as how to say things in a way that is honoring to you and is accurate. I pray for each of these students that their life, Lord, would just be a reflection of you, that it would be a reflection of the fact that they're good students, that they love you, that they are followers of you. And I pray that you would bless them and their families, that they would find grace in their life, they would find the strength that they need to be good students and to follow Christ wholeheartedly each and every day of their life. May your Spirit just rest on them, and may they find the grace that they need to be all that you want them to be. For it's in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ that we pray. Amen. Thank you so much.